My name is Dave Ernest. For those of you who don't know me, I am the chairman of the Louisiana Bar Foundation Grantee Audit and Training Committee. And I welcome you to the second day of our annual training. We have two excellent speakers with us today. They are backed by popular demand. Every year we do a survey after the training sessions to see what people liked, and every year the vast majority of the participants always want to hear from our two speakers again. They can't get enough of them. So if I were to tell you about these gentlemen's accomplishments, we would probably take up most of the time that we have, and I know you want to hear from them. So I'll be brief. Harry J. Skip Phillips Jr. is of counsel with the Taylor Porter firm in Baton Rouge. He and Shelby McKenzie wrote the book on insurance law in Louisiana, and he has probably taught hundreds of students at LSU Law School and has taught them very well on insurance law. He's been active with the Louisiana Bar Foundation for many years, and he is a past president of the foundation. Edmund J. Giering IV serves as general counsel to the Baton Rouge Area Foundation. He is licensed to practice in Texas and Louisiana. And during his tenure with the foundation, he has managed, and this is for the community, Baton Rouge Community Foundation. He's managed the development, award, and administration of hundreds of grants totaling in excess of $150 million in the areas of disaster assistance, emergency relief, health and human services, wildlife, environment, and conservation and education. He's a frequent speaker on government board governance, which he is going to speak about today. He is the incoming president of the Louisiana Bar Foundation, and he will take office in April. So please join me in welcoming Edmund and Skip.
Edmund, you want to go first? Do you want me to say a few words?
Hey, Skip, go ahead. You're
So,
started. You're warmed up.
Well, we appreciate the invitation to visit with you folks again. We started this process a number of years ago just to help our grantees, the grantees of the foundation, and particularly board members, to better understand their roles and responsibilities with respect to their organizations. And frankly, it's an extension of the responsibilities of the foundation board in the furtherance of its fiduciary duty to the corporation, the Louisiana Bar Foundation, and to the work it does in administering the grants program, which, as you all know, is near and dear to all of our hearts. So this morning, Edmund and I are going to talk some about the duties of directors and the obligations of directors. And then we're going to talk some about some financial issues, including an IRS form that you ought to be familiar with. But it works out very well if this is interactive. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can call Renee on her cell phone. I'm not going to do that, Renee. I'm not going to give you cell phone. Or you can email Renee or somehow raise your hand, and we'd love to hear from you and your questions. So, Edmund, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Just to reiterate what Skip said, we joke about this. We first did a similar presentation about almost don't blanch, Skip, 16 years ago. And we scared the devil out of a room full of lawyers. And so once they asked us to tone it back down, we found that this was a little more ready for prime time, and had a great opportunity at Skip's invitation back in 2014 to travel around the state and to visit with the boards of the LSCs and to talk to folks in the communities in and around Baton Rouge, New Orleans, the Acadiana area, and Northwest Louisiana in Shreveport. And that turned into what the committee that Dave now chairs, which is really a compilation of the efforts of the foundation to assist our grantees and to help them to become better and higher performing organizations that we can certainly be proud to sponsor and fund year after year. So we appreciate your participation today, because it certainly signifies your organization's willingness to listen to us and to take some advice or not. But to participate in the process is important, and we're grateful for that. So on behalf of the board of directors of the foundation and certainly the staff and other volunteers, thank you for being with us this morning. We will try to be efficient with the time, but we certainly have this block available for any and all questions. And as unlikely as it may seem with Skip on the call, if we don't know the answer, we will look into it and try to get back to everyone. So
You scared me. I thought you were going to say if we don't know the answer, we're going to make it up. We won't do that. If we don't know the
well,
answer,
yeah.
if we don't know the answer, we'll find out the answer and get it to Renee, and she'll get it out to all of you. So those are the ground rules. So please don't be shy. And Renee's going to be the director of this operation. We're going to screen share some PowerPoint slides that will outline the topics that we're talking about. So Renee, can we go ahead and kick that off, please? All right. So next one. Let's go to the next one, Renee, if you can. There you go. So look, we're going to start with talking about the duties of directors of nonprofit corporations. The business of being nonprofit is important. As you may know from your grant applications and otherwise, one of the qualifications for receiving grants from the Bar Foundation is that the organization be incorporated and have tax exempt status from the Internal Revenue Service. And Edmund's our authority on that status. And if you have questions about how you achieve that status, this would be a good forum in which to ask those questions. So you have a corporation, it's not for profit, so it's not like maybe a typical business corporation you might be familiar with that is set up and privately owned with maybe shareholders or members whose purpose is to do business and to generate profits and salaries for those involved. This, as you all are keenly aware, this is a labor of love, and we certainly compensate staff and pay expenses and deal with money. The idea here is not to make a profit, but to instead engage in certain tax exempt activities as recognized by the Internal Revenue Code. So one of the questions that your representative will be asked as members of the grants committee review applications for grants is, are you a nonprofit corporation? Ordinarily, that happens under state law. And have you achieved tax exempt status? And typically, the Internal Revenue Service makes that determination and issues a letter to you. And then that tax exempt status has some very good consequences, but it also imposes some obligations in terms of reporting that we'll be talking about. What it also does, though, is it imposes some obligations on the directors of the corporation. So all of you are involved in your grantee organizations because you believe in the mission, you support the work that it does, and you want to be a part of furthering that. The Louisiana Corporations Law provides that directors of corporations owe what is called a fiduciary duty to the corporation. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. Sometimes when we are asked to participate as a director in a corporation, we do it because, as I mentioned, we're all involved in the work that the organization does, but we may not always understand completely our legal obligations. So our purpose today in part will be to help explain those to you. The duties of directors are either imposed by state law, but they may also be explained in the bylaws of your organization. So there are two things here you might want to take a note about and ask about. One would be the articles of incorporation of your organization. And that is the document that gets filed with the Secretary of State, which in effect gives birth to your corporation. And then the second thing might be the bylaws. And the bylaws are a creature of the organization, and it lays out the organization's structure, officers, directors, duties, meeting times, lots of stuff you can put in your bylaws that talk about how the organization governs itself. So if you haven't seen those, or you're not familiar with those, or if you don't have a set of bylaws, that's not a bad topic to raise with your executive director, your board chair, or at a board meeting. It's a really good fundamental basis for corporate governance. The only other thing I would add to that would be, if you have a set of bylaws, you need to comply with your bylaws. And so if your business practices don't comply with your bylaws, then you do one of two things. You either change your practices to comply with the bylaws, or you can very easily change your bylaws to comply with your practices. Either way, but they ought to match. Edmund, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that last point is really salient, and it's one that I really hammer home with a lot of the organizations that I work with. You're not, yes, you may be out of sync with the actual words on the piece of paper, but those words on the piece of paper may have been written 15 or 20 years ago. And as Skip said, in addition to seeing all of those documents, it's important to review them from time to time. So when you find yourself as a member of a board and you haven't seen those documents, that's the first question to ask is, I'd like to see the articles, I'd like to see the bylaws, I'd like to see the determination letter, and I'd like to see the most recent 990 to make sure that your organization is up to speed. And then kind of an ancillary to that would be to make sure that the annual with the Secretary of State on a regular basis. Is there a question?
Yeah. Someone have a question?
Sorry about that. Okay.
Oh, that's okay. I heard the same thing.
But to Skip's point, those are the quintessential documents that every director should have access to at really at any time. And then to understand that while the practices may not be what is in the bylaws, it is perfectly acceptable to change the bylaws. I've seen organizations that really got into a bind over thinking that they were, one, doing something wrong, and two, that they shouldn't mess with the original intent of the founders of the organization or things like that. But when you're talking about day-to-day practices that just simply don't match up, or as we've seen more recently, technological changes that have made things like Zoom meetings available to us, which are perfectly acceptable for conducting business if you have it in your bylaws. So it's important to remember that some of the modern conveniences like fax machines and Zoom meetings were simply not around 50 years ago, and we now have the opportunity to take advantage of that. But making certain those are in the bylaws to be used that way.
That's right. And
what the hell happened to my computer?
One of the,
I think we've got some folks who are not muted, and that's what we're hearing.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So if you'll check your mute status, we'd appreciate that. Thank you.
To one of Edmund's points, and something that the Bar Foundation board adopted as a best practice, was large enough to have a governance committee. But the idea more so was to make sure that we put ourselves on a review cycle, so that whether we need to or not, for sure, let's take a look at the bylaws every so often, every 2 years, every 3 years, just to make sure that the things we're doing, the changes in technology, changes in the law, match the way we're doing it. So two important documents should be part of your orientation for your new directors, but more importantly, it should be things that you're conversant about. So next slide, please, Renee. So sometimes when you get asked to be a board member, the natural human reaction is to consider it an honor. And I know that that's the way I think we've all viewed the membership on the Bar Foundation board, which is a self-perpetuating board. The members of the board select their successors, and that is usually the case in the nonprofit world. So you don't have shareholders electing directors. You solicit people who can help your organization, and you invite them to join your board. the initial reaction is, well, that's quite an honor, and it is. And nothing I say here is meant to denigrate that. But there's a difference between being honored to be asked to serve on a board and considering it an honorary position. All of these boards, these director positions, um, are serious in the sense that you're governing this organization that has an important purpose and is the recipient of funds, and you have a duty to make sure that those funds are expended in an appropriate way. So it's an honor, but it's not honorary. And so the distinction I'm trying to draw here is that an honorary position usually doesn't have any real obligations that attach to it. Directorship on a board, nonprofit or not, is a serious undertaking that does have obligations attached to it. And if a director happens to breach those obligations under certain circumstances that I am going to talk about in a minute, so you can exhale here, could result in liability to the director and frankly could damage the corporation. Or affect your ability to receive grants in the future. Fortunately for the Bar Foundation, we have not had that kind of thing happen. Really interested, the staff is interested, Dave's committee is interested in helping our grantees stay within the guardrails here on corporate governance. And the idea would be to make sure that everybody is doing it not necessarily the Bar Foundation way, but the right way. So this notion of fiduciary duty is important, and I'm going to try to explain what it means in the next few minutes. So next slide, Renee. So fiduciary. What a fiduciary duty is an obligation that the law imposes, and it is the sort of the highest, most serious obligation that the law imposes on an individual in the conduct of his or her responsibilities. And it really is comprised of three components. The first is the duty of loyalty. And that very simply is to always put your obligations and the interest of your organization, the corporation, ahead of any personal interest you might have. So if you're asked to vote on something, you need to always keep in mind the obligation to the corporation. And if you have any interest in that issue, then the thing to do is recuse yourself from participation in the voting and the discussion. So loyalty is pretty straightforward. The other thing that we impose on you is a duty of care. And care is just to pay attention. I mean, it's a very simple way to describe this. To attend meetings, to participate in the discussion, and to exercise the judgment and skill that ordinary prudent persons would exercise under similar circumstances. So if you think your role on the board is you bring the donuts and that's all you do, I would say you're not complying with your duty of care. Another question we get sometimes as we talk about duty of care is it okay to object? Is it okay to vote no? Is it okay to ask questions when you may disagree with a proposed action? And the answer to all of those is yes, absolutely. It is not only okay, it is consistent with the duty of care. And Edmund, you may have some thoughts about that. I mean, I know some of the boards tend to always have this notion that we ought to always be unanimous in what we do. But unanimity is not ordinarily required for voting. Maybe it might be for some issues, but ordinarily unanimity is not required. And we shouldn't look at someone who asks questions as being some kind of an outlier or nutty director just because they're not going along with everybody, right?
No, that's exactly right, Skip. A lot of times I think it is the tendency of a new board member to remain silent and sometimes they pick a period of time. I'm not going to say anything or ask any questions for the first 6 months or the first year because I'm really trying to understand the organization. But what then happens, as many of us have seen, is the meeting in the hallway after the meeting, where there's huddled groups and they're discussing the meeting and they're expressing concerns that they did not air or publish in the meeting itself. And so, that doesn't lead to great governance because folks are not having the opportunity to hear what other people think. So I always encourage folks, and for better or for worse, I tend to be that board member as well that will just immediately start asking questions. And look, sometimes those questions are uncomfortable for leadership, and that's okay, because if you have the thought, if the question is circulating out there, it means that it really does need to be addressed. And I think that the part of transparency and part of fulfilling your fiduciary obligations is to certainly ask questions, as Skip said. That's the first way that you can signify and indicate, and oh, by the way, there are minutes of the meeting, and that is proof in some cases that you exercised your fiduciary duty, that you acted in a reasonable fashion, that you questioned the transaction or the issue at hand. And you may be the only one, but in the unfortunate incident that a lawsuit were to ensue, there is a record that Skip Phillips objected to this particular action. So we're really going to have a hard time bringing suit against Skip Phillips as a director of this entity because he wasn't in favor of it. And Skip, you've had a little more experience with the litigation side of those issues.
Yeah, I don't want to scare anybody too much about litigation, but I was going to comment about the importance of minutes and importance of record keeping. So yeah, when we ask you about your financial records and your bank accounts and reconciling and how did you spend the money, that's important. And Edmund's going to talk about the IRS 990 as being sort of a historical document for your organization, but you ought to make sure you insist on accurate minutes. And I've seen, and we've all seen minutes of organizations that go everywhere from there was a meeting on Tuesday, everybody was here, we took care of business, we had a donut and we went home. I mean, that's a bad example or a good example of a really bad set of minutes. The minutes need to be detailed enough to document when the meeting occurred, who was there, what was discussed, generally the votes that were taken, if there were record votes taken, so that you have a historical record of what happened when. Sometimes when we have to look back into the history of an organization, this is all we have to go by. People leave the organization. Unfortunately, we lose people to illness and death. And so sometimes those minutes are all we have. So, and we run into a bad habit of trusting the secretary of the board or the executive director to do a good job with the minutes. But this is something you ought to address at every board meeting. And you need to take the time to read the minutes before you decide that they are adopted. The last duty or component of duty that we want to talk about is the obligation to act in good faith. Again, this is a best interest test. If you have an ulterior motive, you shouldn't be on the board probably. If your motive is to do harm to the organization, you're not going to be acting in good faith. But with respect to an issue, I'm voting the way I'm voting because I don't like Ed. I don't like Edmund Giering, and he's in favor of this, so I'm voting against it. That's not good. That's not acting in good faith. I mean, so you have to put those kinds of things aside. Let's go to the next slide. I'm gonna summarize these components of fiduciary duty, and this is a nice colloquial way of saying this. I mean, if you think about this and you carry out your directorship obligations with the same degree of care that you would in dealing with your own affairs, you're going to be just fine. That's the level of care we look for. If I'm being prudent, we're not deciding because we have $10,000 we haven't committed yet that we're going to have a board meeting in Las Vegas, for example. That's not something a rational person might do just because they got a few extra dollars in the bank. If you treat this as though you were dealing with your own property, your own decision making, I think that's a good way for you to think about what your duties are as a director. And just real quickly, next slide, Renee. So loyalty, no conflicts of interest. You may want to develop a process for identifying those depending on the size of your organization. As an example, at the Bar Foundation, we disclose, we have board members who are affiliated with grantee organizations. They are excluded from discussions and votes about their grantee organizations. And we require our board members to disclose any potential conflict of interest at every meeting. And then they are recused from participating in the discussion and voting. That's how you fix that issue, right? You don't have to resign from the board, excuse me, but you disclose the conflict and you recuse yourself. Next slide, please. So duty of care, remember, ask questions, inquire, satisfy yourself. Can you rely on information you've obtained from other people, like your staff, like your attorneys, like your accountants? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean you have to accept it as rote. You can still ask questions about that. And I would say particularly where if you're dealing with an issue that you're not personally familiar with. The financials, Edmund's going to talk about financials, and if I could do the math, I probably wouldn't be a lawyer, right? But those are the kinds of things where I'm not really clear about exactly what an action, a proposed action might mean, or the information means. That's when you want to make sure you ask those questions. And then finally, next, good faith is acting without any ulterior motives. Keep the best interest of your grantee organization in mind as you carry out your directorship obligations. Okay, let me just talk quickly about liability. So what happens if you mess up? Well, look, this is not a error-free endeavor. It's a human endeavor, and from time to time, people make mistakes. So a simple error is not going to result in any kind of any kind of liability for a director. If it's just a mistake or you're wrong about a fact, you make a bad choice, then that's not going to necessarily impose some kind of financial liability on you. So we have, and to protect against that kind of extreme remedy, we impose this thing called a business judgment rule. So if you're acting in good faith and you don't have a conflict of interest and you just make a mistake, then there's no financial liability for a director. On the other hand, if you know you're making a mistake, or this is just you're disregarding all of the obligations you have to make inquiry before you vote, those kinds of things could result in liability to the financial liability to the corporation. And so that business judgment rule is really important, but it's more important for you to know that we're not looking for error-free environments here. I mean, a lot of this stuff you make a mistake, you can correct. If it's a financial mistake, sometimes that happens and we spend money for things we shouldn't have spent the money on. If it was simply a mistake or an error, there's nothing going to happen about that. But if you do it intentionally, knowingly, then think about it. You really ought to be liable for damages that you may have caused to the organization. Evan, your thoughts about business judgment rule?
No, I think it really, as you described it earlier, the colloquial and very simple way to understand what your obligation is how would you handle your own business? And your business can be your personal business, or it can be your actual source of income business. But to understand that you are asked to manage the affairs of this particular organization in the same way that you would manage your own, really should set your mind at ease, because I think that most reasonable people ask other reasonable people to serve on boards with them. So that really kind of leads to we don't typically go after the mavericks, and we don't typically go after folks who might have a reputation for not honoring the best in business practices or things like that. So, as Skip said, this is something you need to be aware of, but certainly not something that you need to worry about.
It might be worth a comment here about non-performing directors. When we first did this, Edmund, you said it was what, 2014?
Yeah,
We had
that
some
was,
questions.
yeah.
Well, when we had some questions about, we've got these directors who are on our board, but they don't come to the meetings, or they come to every other meeting, or they bring the donuts, but they sit there and don't say anything. And what do we do about them? How do we get rid of them? Well, you ought to have a provision in your bylaws, for example, that deals with, it's a perfect example of something you put in the bylaws so that you say, if you miss 3 consecutive meetings, your position's vacant. Or we can discharge, we can vacate your position, basically fire you if you don't participate. But it also ties into something we'll talk about, hopefully, if we have time, is the recruitment of board members. If you have a self-perpetuating board, if you have a nominating committee, so when somebody rotates off the board, who are we going to go get? What questions should you be thinking about asking that person before you invite them to come to the board? Maybe they're great people, but they may not contribute anything to the governance of your organization. Or they may want to serve, but they really don't want to participate. They want to be able to put this on their resume. And conversely, they ought to be asking you questions if they're not already involved in your organization. Then they ought to be asking you questions about what you do, how you do it before they make a commitment to undertake this director's liability. So, the door swings both ways, but in terms of getting rid of, and you should not tolerate on your board, non-performing directors. They don't do anything to help advance the cause. They just don't, and they're taking up a space on your board that someone else who would really want to contribute could be occupying. So just a thought for you as you recruit and try to fill a vacancy. Now, let me tell you about some protections we offer under the law and under the bylaws. Next slide, please. So, a corporation can indemnify a director for legal expenses or damages that might be awarded through provided for in state law for indemnification. As purchase insurance, and these are called directors and officers insurance policies, provide for defense.
Hey, Skip, can I interrupt you? We're getting some comments that your sound is distorted and folks aren't really able to hear you.
Sad. That's not bad.
Yeah, it's not synced up. Now we can't hear you at all.
All right, I'm gonna quit and come back, okay?
Okay.
All right.
I'll pick up where Skip was, and certainly let me know. Was it just Skip, or are people able to hear me clearly?
We can hear you fine.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Greg. As Skip said, indemnity, and I'll again, this is a brief topic, but you're covered under state law. The statute provides that if you're acting in good faith, if you're acting in the best interest of the corporation, and if a majority of votes of disinterested directors in an issue are in favor of granting indemnity, then it's approved. The issue in most cases is covered in the bylaws. So folks will put that provision or a similar provision to the state law, or it could be as people say in the insurance world, it could be a richer provision that provides a even better benefit than the level of state law indemnification. But it is a protection, and again, I think it's another source of goodwill to get people to serve on these nonprofit boards, knowing that you're not going to be persecuted if a mistake is made. And then the ultimate The ultimate protection, as Skip was trying to tell us, was the directors and officers insurance coverage. We didn't want to jump the gun by talking about the documents you should ask for, but that too should be something that you would want to know is in place. So looking for the declaration page, copy of the declaration page of the D&O insurance is something that ought to be provided and made available to you all as directors, and that's something the staff should look into. How expensive is the coverage? In some cases, we used to say it wasn't very expensive. In the cases of insurance today, the answer is you just got to ask for a quote. Not certain. Is it something that the organization can afford? Well, like any insurance related question, is it ever anything that we shouldn't purchase if we have the means to do so? And as you can imagine, no board is going to get in trouble for purchasing directors and officers insurance coverage for itself ahead of some of the other expenses that may be more program or programmatically related. So again, something not to worry about, just to know that it's available. And certainly, if it's not offered, that would be a discussion at the board level. It'd be something that you'd want to look into. Renee, next slide for us. So this is where we get into really what are the obligations? What is it that you're responsible for as a director? And for those of you who've participated in this presentation before, we haven't made many changes, as you've seen. We may have additional stories, and we may have some other color commentary to liven these slides up. But these don't change. In most organizations, you as a board member are not charged with operating the entity on a day-to-day basis. Your main functions are really threefold, and that is to determine and or set the mission of the organization and make sure that that is being followed. It is to set policy, and that's how the organization goes about doing some of its business, not necessarily procedures, although professional staff will from time to time bring procedures to the board because, one, they'd like to get more eyes on something, and two, they'd like to spark some questions. But three, it's really to give you an exposure to how the organization does run its day-to-day business. And then finally, and can't stress this enough, it's to oversee the financial health and well-being of the organization. And so that means that you have to have an awareness of the finances. Do you have to understand the finances as if you were a CPA? No, you do not. You would hope that you do have some professional training or education that is present in your staff, and that the books and records of the organization are being kept in accordance with the appropriate standards. Are you subject to audit? That depends. In most cases, if you are a grant recipient organization, you are going to be required to produce an audit, a financial audit, and there are levels to that. If you receive monies from the state of Louisiana or any other political subdivision, you are going to be required to have some level of outside audit performed. It could be a compilation, it could be a sworn statement, or it could be the full-blown audit. So those are things that are very important to remember. Next slide, Renee. So when we talk about the mission and these 3 points, know what the mission is, know the governing documents as we've discussed. Those things are the articles, the bylaws, and Skip talked about Form 990, which we get to towards the end of this, because we've shifted the batting order a little bit. We used to talk about that pretty prominently in the middle of this presentation, but we moved it to the middle because we also want to talk about what it is that you do as a director. And the Form 1023 is somewhat different. That was the document that was originally prepared and filed to request the 501c3 determination from the IRS. So it's what the original folks, the original organizers or incorporators, told the IRS what this organization is going to do. Now, what's interesting is in many cases over years, sometimes many years, the mission will shift. And so that 1023 may not necessarily be reflective of what your organization does today. It may be a different name, it may be a different mission, but there are ways through the evolution and lifespan of a corporation to notify the IRS that things are changing. Certainly, name changes are very prevalent. You take that action at the board level, you notify the Secretary of State that the name has been changed, and then at some subsequent point, you will file a tax return notifying the IRS that the name of the organization has changed. It's very similar to if the mission changes. If your charitable purpose is different, you certainly need to let the IRS know that your charitable purpose is different. Typically, there is really no action or response from the service as to a changing mission, as long as it is on its face charitable, educational, scientific, the things that make a charity charitable. And so as long as you're pursuing that, the purposes can be changed. And I'm very familiar with that. Look, it is not, as many of you know, it's not an easy process to put an organization through the IRS. It takes time, it takes a little bit of money, and it certainly takes some effort. And then you have to wait. And sometimes that wait can be 3 months, and sometimes it can be 6 to 9 months. So these determination letters become very valuable, almost as a commodity, right? It's something you don't want to, well, we're not doing that anymore, so we're going to dissolve this organization and we're going to start a new one. Unless there are just a myriad of reasons, and some of them may be financial for doing that, I don't typically recommend that to folks that I'm working with, because that determination was valuable when it was issued, and it's still valuable today from the standpoint of, if all I have to do is change the name of the organization and notify the service that the mission is changing, I can still operate this entity with this tax identification number under this new set of circumstances. So it becomes a much easier process for shifting. You may see two nonprofit organizations merge. We see that in all of our communities from time to time, that their missions are so closely aligned that they now see the benefits of reducing some of the administrative costs and merging the organizations into one. A lot of times it's a merger on its face. They may actually keep both of the entities alive for the purposes of, there may be some other project in the future that we would want to continue to do that. So that, if you ever see the discrepancy in the 1023 that is provided to you and what your organization is actually doing, know that there's nothing nefarious there. It's just probably the evolution and growth of the organization in a different direction. Next slide. So policy, again, developing the goals and objectives that are relative to the mission. So we have a mission. What is it that we want to accomplish, and how do we want to get there? Well, first of all, you have to probably hire someone to carry out that mission. And so in most instances, it's an executive director. It can move towards a president or a CEO type as an organization grows. But there is a valuable distinction there, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So once you've hired someone, you now have taken on the responsibility of a supervisor, right? Your goal, your purpose now as a board, not as an individual, but as a board. And that's very important. The director reports to the board. They do not report to the board chair, although that is typically the conduit or the face of the board when it comes to things like evaluations or salary negotiations, or if you're so fortunate to work for an organization that is able from time to time to give out additional compensation in the form of bonuses or things of that nature. That's typically how those things are communicated. But you've got to evaluate that director. You have to determine if they are doing what they are supposed to be doing relative to the mission of the organization. And you have to compensate that person. And that's one of the kind of the hot topics that's been around quite some time is nonprofit compensation. We saw these issues and we continue to see them in the corporate world with publicly traded companies and certainly with the high profile positions that are associated with universities, with hospitals and large hospital systems. And Skip has a lot of experience with that, having served in one of those board capacities for a hospital system. But the comparisons become, well, wait a minute. You are subjecting my local human services organization that has 3 employees to the same standards that you're applying to the Louisiana State University system or to the Franciscan Missionaries of Our Lady hospital system that has billions and billions of dollars and has the opportunity to hire folks to do all of this and can pay millions and millions of dollars to their employees. That does not quite seem to add up. Well, to a certain extent, you don't have to worry about that. There are some safeguards in place for the amount of compensation.
You lost him? I'm back, by the way. Hi. Can you hear me now? Is that all better, Renee? Is that better, y'all? Okay. So I'm sure he's going to call back, Renee, so let him in. But I was going to interject a point or two as Edmund was talking about this particular section of the presentation. If you noted, he started talking about policy, and in a minute, he was going to talk about finance. A lot of times we, as board members, we're trying to define exactly what our role and responsibility is to the organization. And I heard, well, sometimes we see a lot of boards, whether they're governmental boards or political boards or nonprofit boards, where the board members get too deeply involved in the day-to-day operations of the organization. So a board of directors is not the management committee. Your job is not to schedule the daily activities of the workers or the staff. Your job is not to give individual direction to the executive director. As I heard a citizen tell the local school board one night, you have 2 jobs. One is to manage the finances of the organization, and the second is to set policy and hire the executive director. If you think about those responsibilities in that way, where you're working at a higher level than at management. Now, in some organizations where you have very small boards, board members also volunteer to do other things, and I get that. But keep in mind that you're not there to supervise the day-to-day operations. And just because you're a board member doesn't mean you're entitled to give direction to the executive director. Edmund's exactly correct. Neither, frankly, is the chair, but one of the functions that chairs of boards generally undertake is to be the point of contact, the liaison between the executive director to the board, right? And I see the note from Greg, you're exactly right. Board responsibility is not management of the organization. It is, we talk about this in terms of governance because that word signifies a broader, higher level responsibility, right? And if you think of it as policy and execution of policy, then that usually happens through the executive director. and the financial well-being of the organization, and you stay in those lanes, then you're going to be doing really, really well. Edmund's comments about compensation, the larger your organization and the more money that flows through it, and the more responsibility you give to a CEO type, the higher the compensation may be justified. But there are limits, and we have seen, unfortunately, in the past where organizations have overcompensated their staff, their executive director, and it looked more like it was an organization created and funded for the financial benefit of the leadership and not to further the purpose of the organization. When that happens, you sometimes run the risk of losing your tax exempt status, and that's never a good thing, right? One of the reasons we can do more with less is because we don't have a taxation issue. So I'm going to try to carry on a little bit more here with Edmund's portion of the. Are you back?
Skip, yeah, I'm back, and I apologize, folks. This was not a Zoom issue. This was apparently my overall Baton Rouge Area Foundation system just decided that it was a great time to do some kind of update. So I am on my phone with access. So Skip, please take it away.
We were just talking about policy and finance and governance versus management. I think that was kind of the point you were making.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, the more you get into the weeds of this organization, the more you're out of your lane as a director. Now, that doesn't mean you don't participate at board meetings. It doesn't mean you can call the staff if you have a question. None of that. I mean, it's not like total hands off. It's just that just because you're and we have Edmund and I have both seen this at some of the highest levels of organizations where if you are a board member, that does not give you directive authority over the executive director or CEO of your organization. Collectively as a board, certainly that's part of what you do. But don't get caught in the trap of giving direction to a staff member just because you chair a committee that staff member supports. Guidance, yes. Conversation, yes. But in terms of direction, remember the board functions as a as an organization or as a body to direct the organization, and no individual director should assume that they can do that. And you should always ask yourself, does it matter that Chuck doesn't work on Thursday? That's not your problem, right? If the work of the organization is getting done, leave that to the executive director. Now, in terms of governance, there are some things that are important. The compensation and budgetary concerns, the honest evaluation of your executive director. And I would say to you, honest is an important word here, and consistent with the bylaws or the policy that you adopt. There are some other policies that we routinely ask you about in the application process. Do you have a policy, just like a personnel handbook, if you have more than one employee? Do you have a whistleblower policy? Those kinds of things are important for your staff and employees, but they're important governance tools. If you have policies like that and you implement the policies, then that is consistent with your duty as a director. So I would encourage you to, again, ask about those kinds of things. And if you want some samples, the Bar Foundation's got some great examples of that. And if you wanted to ask Renee, for example, to send you a list of the policies that the Bar Foundation board has adopted, I'm certain we can give you that and Dave will provide you with some assistance and guidance if that's something you need to develop.
Can I interject here? We had
Please.
a couple of great comments in the chat about serving on the board is not managing the organization and staying out of staying in your lane, right? And making some really great points. One of the things that I always like to share, and this is my particular organization. So I wear a bunch of hats, and one of those is general counsel of a nonprofit foundation, and we have a professional staff that reports to a CEO who ultimately reports to a board of directors. But we are also representative of the community, and we like to overshare, if I can use that term. So we inform our board of things like changes to the vacation policy and things of that nature that one might not necessarily think, well, that's not really the board's purview, right? But they need to understand things in the overall context of, say, compensation, right? We understand in the world of nonprofits that most nonprofit employees are paid less than they would be paid at a similar job out in the for-profit world. So if there are some things that could be additive that make that employment more attractive for folks, we think it's incumbent upon us to make certain that our board is aware of things like we may give more vacation days at the foundation than other places do, or we may have our retirement plan may be a little richer than some others simply because it's a way that we can compensate folks and to keep them, right? We can fight attrition by uh, giving folks maybe a better incentive to stay. So things of that nature are not necessarily us asking the board to manage us, but it is certainly giving them a much better view of the landscape of our organization. And I think that that's important because there are questions that directors always have. And one is, do we compensate our people well? Or are we able to compensate better? Or these are things that might not necessarily be particularly in their lane as I'm going to give Skip Phillips a 10% raise this year. But the issue is, how do we sit compared to others? And how important is it that we retain folks to pursue the mission and to pursue the goals and to reach the objectives that we've set? So I make that distinction because I think it's an important one to know that while we don't necessarily need to know what everybody makes, we certainly need to know the environment in which they work and are compensated. And that's just one example.
And Edmund, what I've seen effective boards do is to encourage their president, CEO, executive director, and to always have an agenda item for that person's report to the board. It might not be anything that has to go up for a vote or certainly our decision, but let me just tell you what's been going on. Let me just tell you what's been good. If something bad happened, and we do the same thing. I've seen it done effectively with the board chair too. Sometimes the board chair is a leadership issue or a policy issue, wants to bring something to the attention of the board. It's information. Maybe it's not something you're going to vote on, but the notion, I've always thought that the more informed directors are in general about the ongoing operations, and not to get into management, but the more informed they are, the better directors they'll be. And it kind of ties into the whole notion, next slide, please, Renee, of finance, because if you start talking about giving somebody raises, then you're talking about how it affects your budget. And I would not want to be a budgeteer in a nonprofit organization, particularly when you're relying on income revenue from a variety of grant sources. I mean, it's just like nailing jello to the wall sometimes, isn't it? Really? I mean, how do you know? And one of the things that Edmund will tell you, I think, is with interest rates being where they are and the way the Bar Foundation generates revenue, we have years where we have more available money to grant than we have in other years. And because it is not a precise, steady amount, sometimes we just don't know. And while the foundation has some mitigation strategies for guarding against, significant reductions in revenue, you can't always know how much money's going to be available. How do you budget against that? And what are your contingencies? And do you have a policy for dealing with that? All of that fits into the budget and you ought to be asking your staff, executive director, to get that budget to you far enough in advance of the beginning of your fiscal year for you to understand it, to ask questions, and to make sure that what you're voting on, you understand what you're voting on, and that it is a reasonable financial plan for your organization. And I do think that's sometimes a very difficult thing to do. And so the favorite question should be, your favorite question should be, well, what if? What if we don't get what we're asking for from the Bar Foundation? What if we don't get what we got last year from the Bar Foundation? And you all know there's no guarantee of that. How are we going to adapt to that? Where are possible supplements that we could reach out for? So the budget, in addition to hiring an effective leader, staff leader, working the budget and dealing with the finances are really, really, really important. So make sure you give yourself enough time so that your budget presentation doesn't come at the board meeting a week before the new fiscal year begins, for example. For some of your organizations, an external auditor is required. In lots of cases, it's a good thing to have if you can afford it. And here you need to have either a committee of the whole, depending on the size of your board, or an audit committee that deals solely with the review of your financial statements. Works with your auditor, engages the auditor. And when I talk about an audit committee here, what I'm talking about is excluding management from this committee. If you're an audit tests the execution of the budget and the internal controls within your organization. And of necessity, the people that are dealing with that every day is management and staff. So here, the audit committee is a committee of the board. And the audit committee focuses solely on the results of the audit, or if the organization isn't large enough for the expense of an external audit, maybe you can do it internally using your bookkeeper, CPA, somebody that's helping you. And the idea is not to look at every transaction. Next slide, please. Or to ferret out anything that might have been an inappropriate expenditure, but generally is the presentation of your financial statement accurate and reflective of the financial affairs of the company. And a financial report, if you're thinking about an agenda for your organization and things you ought to talk about at every board meeting, mention the minutes, that's important. But you need to get a financial report at every meeting. And the form of that's going to be up to the board. You might want an income statement, a balance sheet. I don't think you want to go through the checkbook necessarily, but you need to have an understanding of the financial affairs of the organization. And this is something is ordinarily ripe for questions. Maybe not about particular expenditures, but maybe trends. How are your expenditures and revenues to date comparing to budget? Are we opposing the best practices? Are we doing things internally that we could outsource at a reduced cost? Those kinds of things are very important. Things like internal controls are something I always ask about. Is your organization one that ought to require two parties signing every check? Is there some limit above which two people ought to sign, and who should those people be? How do you deal with payroll and payroll taxes and things that you could be responsible for as a director or an officer if they're not properly cared for? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that you would ask about in your own business or personal affairs that you ought to be asking about at a board meeting. So minutes, any items that require a board vote, action items, adoption of policies, those kinds of things, but always a financial report in sufficient detail to inform you of the current financial condition of the organization. And sometimes, as the foundation staff, in the furtherance of the foundation's fiduciary duties, gets information regarding utilization of funds or organizations or potential audit difficulties. Dave and his committee will go and make a visit. We started doing that a number of years ago, and it's really a help visit. We need to keep you within the governance guidelines here so that we can continue to fund you as a grantee organization. We're not in the furtherance of our fiduciary duty. We're not going to be able to continue to grant you money if you're not utilizing it properly and if you're not providing sufficient safeguards. And the last thing that I can tell you, the last thing the foundation wants to do is to defund or stop funding a worthwhile organization that can't simply get out of its own way. So if you're going to pick something to ask your executive director about or your president about, that always overarching, in my view, it is the financial health and well-being of your organization. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute to see if there's anybody with questions, and you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can text Renee, because I don't know that we're going to go into a lot of detail on the program and administrative priorities. Renee, you've exported these slides or can export these slides to everybody that's participated, right?
Yes, we're going to circulate after the presentation.
And I would tell you, let me commend a quick read of those to you because we spent some time trying to explain in a little more detail the relationship between the board and the executive director. And when Edmund was talking about the first time we did this around the state for the legal services corporations, that was one of the most asked about topics, and so it's why we address it. So what's the role of the executive director? What's the role of the board in dealing with the executive director? Keeping in mind that if you're the chair of the board, you need to be overseeing, if you are the executive director's functions on behalf of the board as a whole. And so we've laid out in that section in some detail how the board and the executive director ought to interact and at what levels. We also talk here about recruiting and retention of board members. And I often thought that of all the things that a board does in a self-perpetuating board, like I think most of ours are, selecting your successor was one of the most important things you could do for the long-term well-being of the organization. Finding those people who have a like interest and who are willing to participate actively and who understand their duties to the board. And Renee, you can just kind of skip ahead to the recruitment and retention of board members section here, well, right there. And so even if you know somebody and you think you know them pretty well, there are some questions and things if you're a member of a nominating committee or if you're tasked with trying to identify some likely board members, some things you just want to ask. I mean, and like I said, the last thing you want to do is hire somebody who's well-intended, but who sees their role as simply bringing the donuts to the board meeting. And picking your successor, training the new board members who in the Bar Foundation world move up through the ranks to leadership positions for the continued well-being of the board and the organization. One of the most significant things, other than maybe hiring the executive director, you can do. And then the other side of that is to have be prepared to answer questions from the prospective board members about, what do you want me to do? Why are you asking me to do this? Those people who ask you those questions, I would say the harder the question, the more interested you ought to be in those people, because they're thinking about their role on the board and their contributions to the board, and they're making this as a serious decision, which is what you want. Another thing that is a good general practice for boards is a self-assessment or self-evaluation. Every now and then, talked about reviewing the bylaws. So every now and then, maybe it's a good thing just to pause, and Bar Foundation has done this in the past. You just do a little questionnaire. Ask yourselves, how well are we doing? How well are we serving? How well are we serving the constituents that we have? how well are we interacting organizationally? How efficient are we in the use of our money? Uh, be candid about it, because these are things that the board can change and that the board can do. Most of you are doing an exceptionally good job of this, but I think every one of us could say fairly that there might be a weakness or two that you see, and a survey of some kind, whether it's anonymous or not, is a good way to identify a weakness or even a strength that you might want to leverage. You can also ask yourself how you're doing vis-a-vis the community. And that's particularly, you can go ahead and skip down, Renee, particularly important if you rely in whole or part on the community for any of your financial resources. Do you do fundraising? Should the board be involved in fundraising? I know you had a really good presentation yesterday on fundraising, and so I'm sure you had some discussions about this. Some boards, a function of the board, a function of a director is to assist in fundraising. And some boards, that's just not true, and you're worried more about governance and how the money is used and how the money is spent. So I don't know that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that question as much as just to know whether that's part of your role and to make sure that an incoming or a recruited director understands, because it's not always assumed that a director is going to also be a fundraiser. Another time here for us to pause and see if you have any questions about, and I'd encourage you to take a look at the slides, these slides that we've zipped through in more detail, just to see if it might trigger some questions you have either back for us or within your own board.
Yeah, Skip, these as you all can see, these sections are pretty text heavy, and so what they were intended to do was to give you a resource. At one of the questions in the chat was again reiterating, will the deck be presented or distributed? And the answer to that is yes. Once we finish, Renee will make certain that this is distributed. Yeah. And feel free to take any of these snapshots or any of these lists of questions or any of the information back to anyone who was not able to attend. Question in the chat: do you have any recommendations for the timing of board member recruitment? For example, is it once or twice a year versus a rolling basis? Skip, I think we both have thoughts on that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think one of the things you do in your bylaws is you set the terms of boards and you say when the terms begin. I've been on boards where the director's term begins on the date they accept or maybe even attend their first meeting, and it's for some period of time. And your bylaws ought to say, one effective way to get rid of a non-performing director is to term limit them, right? Thank you for your service. Your term has expired. We enjoyed having you on the board. Go find something else to do. We're going to find somebody that's not just going to be a pet rock here, right? But your bylaws ought to provide for how many years you can serve on the board. I mean, not every board member director ought to serve perpetually. I just rotated off a board that I very much enjoyed serving on, and had I had the option, I would have stayed. But I also understand the goodness in having a rotational policy, because you bring new blood in, and that's kind of tied to what I was talking about in terms of hiring your successor. You bring fresh blood in, and it's a reinvigorating process for the board. But that ought to be spelled out in your bylaws. And on the other hand, some organizations do this like on a fiscal year. So if your fiscal year, Evan, you tell me from a tax purpose, I don't know how many can start in July anymore, and the IRS wants them to be calendar years, but a lot of organizations just do board terms on calendar years. So, and knowing when, tracking who's going to rotate off at what time is a good thing to do. So if you've got a 10-member or 12-member or 11-member board, knowing which board members are in which part of their term, so you can serve, for example, 3 consecutive terms. All right, so how many times were you reappointed? And you should reappoint board members. Don't just assume that they're going to continue to serve. You ought to vote on them when you reappoint them for another term. Some bylaws, some corporation boards provide for a break in service. You can serve 2-3 year terms, and then you got to sit out for a year. And if you want to come back and be considered for another term, you can do that, but you got to take a break. I would say though, if you monitor those and manage those, this is a board function. If you manage the membership and the terms of the board, I think I would start working on replacement board members, new board members, not later than 3 to 4 months out if you're really going to vet them, and have a nominating committee or a committee of the whole recommend them to the entire board. Once you know they understand the mission of the board, of the organization, they're willing to serve, and then you present that to the board and let the board as a whole makes a decision about inviting a new member. So you can do it any way that works for you. But again, this is a thing that ought to be in the bylaws. Whatever you're doing needs to be in your bylaws.
Yeah, that's right, Skip. And I think another important thing to say on this is you can find yourself, for better or for worse, in a situation where you have board members leaving and rolling off at odd times and not staying on what you would hope would be the schedule or the calendar set forth in your bylaws. And so they need to speak to that. Is a new person coming in, are they filling a partial term to keep the calendar straight, if you know what I mean? Or are they just starting up? And I've seen organizations do it both ways. It can become a nightmare in tracking terms if folks aren't generally starting the same time and generally finishing the same time. So in our case, we typically have an annual meeting in March where we elect new directors and we re-elect those who are in a second, going from a first to a second term. And, and that can happen anytime between really March 1st and kind of April 15th. We're gonna set new people in place, and they'll sit as a board in May for their first meeting, and then they'll roll through, 3-year term, 6-year term, and be finished unless they've gotten into leadership. And then, this is one of the quirks, is, as we've said all along, you can put things in your bylaws as long as you're following those. And so we have organizationally come up with, sometimes our executive committee or our nominating committee, they miss the boat. Like we had a director who was fairly quiet for 3 or 4 years, and then all of a sudden really showed us some leadership in those last 2 years. And they were never really considered for the leadership track. And so, now we have provisions that allow for a person serving in their 6th year to continue to serve if they meet certain criteria or are going to be nominated for a vice chair or a chair or something like that. So, it's just the rules that we play by, and we have changed those over the years. So there's no great example. A lot of times what you see are organizations that will set their calendar based on their activities. So Skip's very well aware of a theater organization here in town that its fiscal year started September 1st, almost like the federal government, right? Like they really picked an odd, they didn't pick October 1st, and they didn't do it on a quarterly basis. They picked September 1st. And that was really to indicate the official kind of end of summer and the beginning of the quote unquote theater season. So they wanted to fiscal year match up their financial records with the cash flow that was coming in from ticket sales. It makes perfect sense when you think about it in the context of the way that they are trying to organize their financials, but it didn't make a lot of sense in terms of how it sits with the calendar and how it sits with fundraising. And, they're just starting their year, and yet people are considering their end of the year gifts and things of that nature. So those are all things that need to be considered by the board and I would say in the staff as well.
Yeah, I just would keep in mind this is a board function. So, however
Yeah.
you decide to manage it as a board, maybe the board chair should do it. It's a board function, and second to, what we talked about in terms of policy and finance, the continuity. And I'll add one more thing, and then we can go on to the next topic. But it's a really, really good idea to do some sort of an orientation of an incoming board member, a new board member. And you don't have to do it in a PowerPoint presentation. You can just make sure that they go and sit and talk to the executive director, for example, and maybe talk to the chair and another board member who can orient them on how the board functions and how the board. So you don't get there to your first meeting and that you're drinking out of the proverbial fire hose, trying to understand how the organization works without having any context for that. On the other hand, I always recommend to a new board member that they go and talk to the board chair and go and talk to the executive director, even if they're not invited to do that as a formal orientation process, to make sure they get the lay of the land and the understanding. And a good executive director might want to know from an incoming board member. So if you have some ideas about how we can improve what we do, call me. Let's talk about that. I mean, I may not implement it and you can't direct me to implement it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. And that's a really good way to start to do some team building with your new board members. So, hey, Renee, we've been at it for about 90 minutes, and I know we want to talk about the 990. We still good to go?
Still good to go.
All right. So earlier in the presentation, Edmund talked about the IRS Form 990 and where we used to talk about it, but now we're going to talk about it.
That's right.
So, yeah, it's like the old Army thing. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you what I told you, right?
That's
so,
right.
This document, if you have not been exposed to it for your organization, it's something you need to ask about. It tells your story. It gives you an opportunity to tell your story. And I would say, for granting organizations to whom you apply for money, this is a source for them to go to, public source, for them to find out about you. Something you file with the IRS, independent of what you put in your grant application, consistent, I hope, but independent. And so the value of it probably is greater than most people appreciate it. It's not just like filing an informational tax return. It's just not one more thing to check the box. So Edmund's our resident authority here, as you might have imagined. So Edmund, it's all yours.
Well, as Skip said, I mean, there's so much information in the 990, and it is a valuable resource and tool not only for the organization itself, as Skip said, and we are fans of, to tell your story, because this is your chance, right? There are open-ended questions that allow you to describe in great detail your mission, some of the activities that you carry out, the organizations that you work with, those that fund you and those that you fund, or the programs that you're administering. And then it also lets you tell a little bit about how the organization is run. And you do get into things like compensation, but you're also looking at the finances and how well the organization is run. Is it running in the red? Is it running in the green? Do they have sufficient assets available to them? And that's one of the challenges of the nonprofit world is, as we have seen since Hurricane Katrina, that there just aren't a lot of savings accounts available to nonprofit organizations. And so in times of crisis, who do you turn to? You either turn to the meager resources that you may have saved, and I'm certainly speaking in very general terms here. So, or as almost all do, you turn back to the funding community, and whether that's individual fundraising or if it is grant writing or any of the things that are available to you, and those only go so far, and they also have time frames in them, as you know. we offer grants, but we offer them on a schedule, and it has to be an application, and there has to be a review, and there has to be a determination and vote of the board of directors, and then we'll make those distributions. Now, thanks to Skip's long service, I'm grateful to chair the grants committee for the Louisiana Bar Foundation this year. And I get to see the amount of work that goes into this, not only at the staff level, and Renee manages that process beautifully, but she sets up the committee members and ultimately the board for success by giving us as much information as possible. And again, all of that really stems from some of this information that you're able to gather throughout the year and compile in your Form 990. So why is it such a big deal? I always like to talk about these points. Yes, Skip.
If I wanted to look at a 990 for one of our grantee organizations, can I do that? Or do I have to have some kind of affiliation with the organization? So just thinking about our participants here, if they, at the end of this, they're so fired up that they want to go look at this thing, can they go to some website and find the 990 for their organization if one's been filed?
There are a couple of websites that are available publicly and easily, GuideStar being one, guidestar.org, and Charity Navigator being another. And then there's Candid, which I think now owns GuideStar, so you probably see the name pop up. All of those are, if you are able to type in a name, you can locate an organization and ultimately get to the most recent publicly available, well, I shouldn't say that, the most recently published 990. So you may be, as we sit here in 25, you may be looking at a 23 return, but that's not unusual. For instance, the Bar Foundation is on the verge of filing its 23 return, and it's now February of 2025. The Baton Rouge Area Foundation just filed its 23 return in November of 24. So one, it takes a while to cycle through the system, but it's still very, very valuable. I don't want anybody to think that that's, just because it is on its face dated, that the information is not useful. The other avenue, and this is important to know, so all of you board chairs and executive directors, listen up. If asked, you are supposed to produce your 990. So a member of the public can walk into your office and very politely ask you to let them see your 990. Now, it's very much like a public records request. You're certainly able to charge them for copies and things like that, but they are well within their rights, and it's covered in the presentation to ask. And why is that? Well, because you are, by virtue of having received the tax exempt status, subject to those types of requests. And that look, again, we're back to transparency. That was part of the IRS's concern. They wanted to make certain that charities were not operating in the dark and that people understood where the money was coming from, where the money was going, and how the organization was using it, both on its own operations and for the public purposes of charity. So you see those 5 highlights there. Skip?
I was going to say one other thing. I know you're going to walk through the report, but so is this one of the approval things for the board? Does the board have to approve the 990 before it's filed? What's the board's role, other than what you're going to talk about? What's the board's role in certifying accuracy and that sort of thing, if any?
So the 990, technically, the board does not have to approve the 990, but the board has to see the 990. And so there is actually a question buried deep in Part 6, Section whatever, that says, yes or no, was the 990 reviewed by the board of directors prior to filing? And so organizations do this differently. Many organizations still ask for a vote to approve it and authorize its filing. That's perfectly acceptable. But the organization need only, at the bare minimum, show that it was made available to the board of directors and that they had an opportunity to comment, ask questions, make changes prior to it being filed. So organizations do this differently. They'll hopefully distribute it or make it available at a board meeting and people can pass it around and look at it, or people can get their own copy. They'll send a link, which is much more prevalent these days, to let folks know that it's available. Or in the case that we used to do was we distributed it and then we set up a conference call. And if anybody called in and had questions, they could ask their questions. And as you can imagine, in most instances, most of the board didn't call, didn't question. But we were able to document in some way, shape, or form that we had done what we said we did. And so, as I always tell folks, Skip's heard this many times, I like to check the yes box. I don't like to check the no box on the 990 because no typically means you got to explain something. Yes is usually the answer that they're looking for.
Yeah, and I would say this, sometimes depending on the complexity of this report, it can be kind of time consuming to go through it. But I think there are some parts of this that Edmund's going to talk about that are worth you spending a few minutes with. Number one, make sure you get the opportunity to do this. That's something as a board member you should insist upon, that you get the opportunity to ask questions. But it's worth some particular parts of it are clearly worth your time here and to keep you informed as a board member. So, Edmund.
And then we've touched on this a couple of times, but really this was a blurring of the lines when we started seeing the 990 with its changes, which now go back almost 15, 16 years. It was, folks remember Sarbanes-Oxley. It was a direct result of Congress asking really hard questions of our, publicly traded companies, and then making some determination that, well, again, going back to my analysis of the hospital systems and university systems and these big nonprofit corporations, we want to know how you are doing what we've asked the publicly traded companies to do. And so those are the things that they look at. And then that's been a hot topic for quite some time is the regulation and reporting of political activity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is why we come to where we are today with the 990. Renee, next slide. So we've said it in almost every aspect, whether it's fiduciary responsibilities, whether it's in reviews of the financials, or now here. What is the purpose? What are the guiding principles? It's to enhance transparency, it's to promote compliance, and it's to minimize, we say this in air quotes, the burden of filing, the burdens on the filing organization.
Yeah, well,
these changes made the 990 much longer. It has a lot of questions. It requests a lot of added information. And it has a lot of subparts, and we'll talk about that. Next. So here you go. The core document is 11 pages. It has 11 parts, and it provides more than 175 lines of information. The instructions are even bigger. It has a sequencing list to help put it together. It has a 9-part appendix. 140 definitions are in its glossary, and it has schedules A through R. So you're getting into, 18 schedules or so. It's a big document. Next. Here's the core questions. When it talks about governance and policies, it is intended to be an educational tool for the organizations. By asking these questions, organizations were prompted to think about things that they had not necessarily thought about and provide policies that they did not necessarily have at the time. The guidance that came out all those years ago, and the IRS still sticks to it, is that no particular question will trigger an audit, but in the context of other information that you might provide, they may have further inquiries. And I always like to point this out to folks. Sections A, B, and C, this is where we talk about, do you have a conflicts of interest policy? Again, remember Edmund's little piece of advice, and certainly my opinion. I like to check yes. I don't like to check no. So for organizations that didn't have a conflicts of interest policy, we developed one, and they can check the box yes. Do you have a whistleblower policy, as Skip said? Most organizations did not prior to 2008. They got one then, they checked the box yes. Whistleblower, joint venture policies, which always seem very strange, but that's really a Sarbanes-Oxley hangover. Document retention and destruction, like any good organization, you need to have a policy about that. I say need, I suggest it. Again, it's a yes or no option. Because if you don't, then they want to know, well, what do you do? Do you just have you saved documents for the last 62 years, or what's the process? And most accounting principles would tell you that document destruction is a good thing to do, right? I mean, that's the other part of this.
Yeah, Ken, we sometimes are a little reluctant to throw away some old document because we don't know if we're going to need it or not. Well, number one, in today's day and age, chances are it's probably stored electronically somewhere in your system that you could retrieve it, probably. But number two, sometimes you just don't want to have stuff around that is older than you could reasonably anticipate needing it. So having a records retention policy, I mean, even for public records for state agencies, is there's a destruction or disposal schedule. And you need A, to have one, and B, to comply with it, right? So that if you're asked for something that's 25 years old and you don't have a policy that says you keep documents for 25 years and you threw it away, then that's what you say, right? If you have it and maybe you wish now you didn't have it, I hate to be so cynical, but that's the kind of the lawyer in me coming out.
That's right.
You're going to regret having kept it when you just were afraid to throw it away. So that's another really good policy.
And we see that from time to time. We will have a donor who will show up 7, 8, 10 years after a particular donation may have been made, and they're looking for a copy of an acknowledgement letter. And while we may have saved an act of donation as translative of title into something or something very important, we didn't necessarily save an acknowledgement letter that was really only good for the tax year in which it was issued. So being able to respond with, well, per our destruction policy, we destroyed most of the files related to this matter 5 years ago or 3 years ago or whatever it is. So those are important distinctions and certainly things to think about. Next slide, Renee. So Section A talks about governance, and it really is, it's important because these are all the things that we've talked about, right? How many directors do you have? What is how are assets moved, and what's any kind of corrective action if something was inadvertently diverted? Is the board controlled by other persons? What does that mean? You might have family members who serve on boards, and are there enough related people that they could have a majority of the vote? Do they have, can they swing people who might work for them? Are there people who are co-workers that work for the same entity? Things of that nature are important to disclose. The Form 990 review process, as I said, provided to the board before it's filed. How do you do that? What's the process? And I gave you a couple of examples a moment ago. It can be distributed. It can be made available electronically via a link or an email. It can be passed around at a board meeting. Any of those. It can be the board can be notified that it's available at the office for inspection. That's not really great because it's not providing it to them. It's giving them an opportunity to come see it, but we like to make certain that at least it touched their hands or their eyes were able to be laid on it before it was filed. Is there any delegation of management control? In a larger organization such as mine, you might see, the board delegates to the CEO. Well, the CEO is able to delegate to an executive team. That's not necessarily the case in smaller organizations. The Bar Foundation is very similar. There are departments and there are department heads and there are things that go on that aren't necessarily the president and CEO is not making every decision as to how those things are run. And then we talked about at the beginning, it's one of the things that Skip and I really stress, contemporaneous documentation of board and action committee. That's minutes. Did you take minutes? Did you keep records? Minutes can be in the form of recordings. Like a lot of folks nowadays just turn on the record on their phone and sit down. Do they ever type the minutes up? I don't know. But do they keep those electronic digital recordings of the meetings as records? That's okay. That is a contemporaneous documentation of board action if it was recorded.
Such as this training event today.
Exactly. Next slide, Renee. And then section 6, again, we're talking about family and business relationships. Who are the officers, the directors, or their trustees? Key employee, what's that? In some organizations, folks are considered key employees if they are paid above a certain level. And paid means, are there benefits? Do their benefits add up to a certain number? And at one time was $150,000. It was $100,000 at one point. It's been bumped up to $150,000. That's not too hard to do if you pay somebody in the high five figures and they have a retirement and they might have some other benefits that really kind of bump them there. So it's good to know what those limitations are or what those limits are, and then who needs to be reported. It's one of the kind of the cold hard truths of working for a nonprofit organization is that your salary and other compensation may be publicly available. Mine certainly is. A lot of people really don't like that fact. I kind of came to grips with that 18 years ago when I chose this line of work. So as a part of that 990, there is the opportunity to look at the compensation of some folks. That's not a bad thing because that is also a tool to be used to determine if your own organization is paying appropriately. So
one question that comes up sometimes is just how much of the money that you're receiving is attributable to overhead, right? I mean, you might remember a number of years ago, nationally, the United Way was criticized because its overhead expenses were viewed as being disproportionate to a lot of other organizations. And you want to make sure, and you can, there's data out there for this, but that's a way if I'm a grantor or a foundation that's looking to give you money, I want to make sure you're not spending all the money on salaries and ingratiating, benefiting people who simply work there as opposed to supporting your purpose. And looking at that as a way I can tell very quickly. So it's for a nonprofit, it's a very valid data point.
Yeah, and to Skip's point, it's proportionality issue as well. If our colleague Ralph Stevens, who has done this presentation with us a few times over the years, is a CPA and partner in the former firm of Postaway to Netterville, now Eisner Amper. And Ralph used to tell a story of a client who had established a very small nonprofit. He was a professor at LSU and had a particular interest and established his nonprofit. And he generated on the order of 100 and 150, somewhere around no more than $200,000 a year. And he paid himself $35,000 or $40,000 a year to run the organization. And he was audited. And the agent said, well, that's just totally out of line with the amount of money that this organization brings in and the programs that they spend. And, for better or for worse, this guy was not going to let go. And he hired Postal 8 to defend him, and Postal 8 had to do a salary survey. And the salary survey showed that no, not only was he appropriately paying himself, he was underpaying himself. That for an organization doing what he was doing, raising the amounts of money that he was able to do in the limited amount of time that he had as a part-time organization, quote unquote, executive, that it was absolutely appropriate for the community in which he operated in. And so that shows the power of the 990 is that organizations are able to look at other organizations and make some determination. And I think that's been helpful, particularly when it comes to setting compensation and setting employee expectations. It works both ways. It's a tool to make sure that you're in the ballpark, and it's also it's a tool to be used in the evaluation and compensation process to let folks know that you're fairly compensated for what you do.
Yeah, but can you comment on, so how do I know? I'm a board member, nonprofit organization. I'm located in Lafayette, Louisiana.
Yeah.
And we think we need to pay the executive director X. How am I going to know whether that is reasonable, in line with, or justifiable? Are there sources of information out there other than other 990s, I guess,
Yeah.
where you
Yeah,
just
well, typically that's where it all stems from, right? There are some groups that actually, and my organization is one of them, and the Bar Foundation may be as well, that volunteer that information. They will send it off to, a magazine or an organization that compiles this information, in which they will turn around and share those surveys with the participants. So it's not necessarily readily available, but if you have the opportunity to be in the number of organizations that are supplying that info, you can typically get it for free. There are paid studies and surveys that are available. They are, in my opinion, very expensive. And so it's not something that you would suggest to any organization that you buy every year. But what you may want to do is to talk with some colleague organizations and say, guys, would you like to go in on this, and let's buy this? And we will now have an official record of a study or a survey that we can all put into our files, and it justifies where we are paid. So, Skip, it's a couple of things. One, it's looking at organizations that do what you do, no matter where they're located, right? You could start with folks that are doing the same work in New York City. Now, that's not going to carry as much weight as if Lafayette looked at folks doing the same work in Shreveport and Alexandria and Monroe and Baton Rouge, and et cetera. But you have that available. And it also, I think that there are ways for organizations to think about this process. And one of the things that I have been a big proponent of is for, folks say, well, gosh, it looks like we're paying too much. We're on the higher end of a scale. Well, the scale is accepted, and not everybody can be 50%, and not everybody can be the median. And I always tell organizations, look, somebody has to be number one.
Yeah.
You can be the organization that is paying a little bit more or paying a lot more, as long as it's reasonable. And going back to what's reasonable, well, Skip said it, and we've hammered it home, but it's the outset of this. Is it reasonable to pay someone this amount of money in Lafayette, Louisiana, to do a job where their expectations are X, Y, and Z? And if the answer to that by a board of peers at a board of directors level is yes, of course it is, then you're protected. You have the ability. So this is where transparency is very important. And, it goes back to gathering as much information as possible, having those conversations, and comparing that information that's received to other likely or like situated organizations that are doing substantially the same work. There's really no substitute to comparison in this particular case.
Got it. Thank you.
Next, Renee. Okay, so policies. And there was a question in the chat, which was timely a few minutes ago, and I started picking out an answer. This is going to kind of help. The question in the chat was, what basic or essential committees should the board have at a minimum in order to do its due diligence? And the question said fundraising, executive, strategic planning, audit, finance, others, question mark. This will help. We've talked about this a bit. I think it's essential, or at a minimum, you should have an executive committee and you should have a finance committee. Skip is a big proponent of the audit committee, and I can't disagree with that. So some subset of those folks that are an audit committee that the executive director or the staff do not participate in is very important. But that also drives some of these other questions. You may simply just not have a very big board, or it's just not difficult to get together. And so a committee of the whole to do these things is not unusual.
Yeah, I was going to say, size of your board matters. Organization I was on had a 18-member board. It was easier to have separate committees to do committee-related work than another board that I've been on that had 7 board members. And almost everything we decided to do, we might have had a different chair title, but all of that was essentially a committee of the whole. What I would say is, again, this is kind of driven by what are you doing and what are your needs?
That's right.
You could have a finance committee that also functions as an audit committee. And the difference might be that your executive director sits as a member of the finance committee, but management doesn't sit as a member of the audit committee. So when you're talking about the audit, you put your audit committee hat on. Yeah. Executive committee, the executive committee usually, according to your bylaws, would be authorized to exercise the powers of the board, either between regular board meetings or when the board couldn't be convened to conduct and to undertake the issue. I would say you got 2 things about executive committees. One is your executive committee should never be so large that it is a quorum of the board. So if you have a 11-member board, you shouldn't have a 6-member executive committee, because then you just have a board, right? I mean, so think about that. And then the second part of it is with the best organizations I have been in have always kept minutes of the executive committee's actions and presented them to the board at the board meeting. Now, could they, for ratification, maybe, could the board object to the action taken by the executive committee? Yeah, that doesn't happen too often. But again, it's a matter of information here.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
And so if you are going to have in a larger organization what is usually called a consent agenda, and provide minutes of all of the committee meetings that have happened between board meetings and ask for approval of those minutes, that's perfectly okay. Some of this is just driven by your need. I mean, if you're big into fundraising in the community, you might want to have a small fundraising committee, but there's really no template, I would say, except what Edmund mentioned. I am a big proponent of audit committees because that's an important function, fiduciary duty, responsibility. And I do think executive committees make management, it reduces the need to have more frequent board meetings, perhaps. Another question for you: how often should your board meet?
Right.
Some boards, I would say quarterly is kind of a minimum norm. But I do know some organizations where the board meets monthly just because they got a lot going on and they got a lot to talk about. So if you meet quarterly, your executive committee is more likely to have stuff to do. If you meet monthly, probably not so much on the executive committee side.
That's right.
All driven by the size and complexity of your organization. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, Skip, that's a great summary of that. And I'm working for an organization that still has a very active executive committee, as does the Bar Foundation. The Bar Foundation meets on a quarterly basis. The executive committee handles everything in the interim of those other days outside of the year. So if it's 365 days in a year, the executive committee is taking action 361 of those days in most years. At the Boundary Jerry Foundation, we're a little more active. We meet as a board about 6 times a year and sometimes 7, and it just depends. But we also meet as an executive committee about 6 or 7 times. So they're kind of offsetting each other with action and activity, because we are, a fairly robust grant-making organization there's lots of money moving left and right. And so folks need to keep their eyes on that.
One other thing you would think about is what's the composition of the executive committee? And typically in your bylaws, you provide for officers of the board, like a chair and or a president, a vice chair, a secretary treasurer, typically, or an immediate past presidents. Typically, the officers comprise the executive committee, but it's also a good way to orient or introduce other board members to some of the leadership functions. Right?
Yep.
And so as the chair ordinarily selects the committee members, that's something I always thought about was it's good to have the people who are the veterans and who know how this works, but let's draft 1 or 2 of the newbies, right? Or the intermediate people we think may be future leaders of the organization and orient them to leadership by letting them serve on the executive committee.
That's a great point. We've done that as well. We have an at-large seat that is appointed by the board chair. And we actually added a little twist a few years ago. It doesn't even have to be a board member. Because we have members of the foundation, we can actually go to our membership. And that's allowed us to bring back maybe some of the historical leadership and the institutional knowledge to bring a person in that can sit in the executive committee, offer advice, still has a vote, but has the opportunity to lend a different perspective to it. So it works both ways. Skip, you can bring in new folks, and you can bring in the folks who have the history.
Yep, it's continuity. So, all right, look, we're at 2 hours. Let's see if maybe we ought to try to wrap this up at the interest of our 53 remaining Road Warrior participants here.
That's it, and we certainly appreciate. Renee,
Absolutely.
I'm not sure how many slides we still have. Can you I can't see it on the. Okay.
I would.
So we had a pretty good bit, but let's go to that very last slide.
Yeah.
Let's go to that last one. And I apologize. You shut it down. Right here. Yeah, your story. One back. I'm sorry. There you go. All right. So not that you need another committee, but we have suggested in the past, and we'll do so again today, that you might have a committee that helps to prepare the 990, or at least looks at it along the way. These are important things, but again, I want to stress for you, as Skip has throughout this, our organizations are dependent upon funding from somewhere. And funding comes when people tell compelling stories. We've all heard about, making the case statement. This fundraising lingo. The 990 is a case statement. It's just in a different form, and it allows you to provide as much or as little information as you deem necessary. Now, look, people are always like, well, it's public. I don't want to disclose too much, and we want to put the bare minimum in here to pass muster. But the fact of the matter is, it's Schedule O. It's the narrative section. It is blank lines on a sheet of paper that the IRS has given you to tell your story. So taking all of that financial information, taking all of that compensation information, taking all of that programmatic information as to who you're working with and who funds you, and being able to wrap that into a few paragraphs of information that the public knows to look at if they're so choose, but funders definitely know to look at. And as anybody who's participated in one of our visits from the LBF knows, that the information that you compile, your 990 is in there. That's one of the things that we look at. And we look at the date, we make sure that it's up to date. We're making sure at least from our perspective, that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. At the same time, under Dave's leadership, we're offering advice and guidance as to how you might be able to do it better. Or if we see something that needs to be addressed, we're taking a look at that. So you're being helpful to us as a funder, but you're also being helpful to the public by providing this information. So I can't stress enough. Again, I know these last few slides they're really text heavy, but they're written in fairly plain English. And we hope that if you have an opportunity to take a look and have any questions about these topics or these items, that you'll certainly reach back out to Renee and she can get those questions to us. We really enjoy the opportunity to do this. Skip and I laugh about it that it's become second nature, and yet we still stress over how much material we have and how we're going to communicate this to you all. And we are always looking for suggestions on what we can and should and shouldn't be providing. So if anything pops up, you have any critiques of us, we certainly appreciate that as well. Skip, you want to close us out?
Edmund, I would say, please reach out to Dave and Dave's committee or to Renee about any questions or assistance you need about this. It's a great avenue for expertise and support. And trust me, it's consistent with our the board members' fiduciary duties to the foundation to do this with you. We sometimes get a little bit off track, and we didn't tell you too many war stories today, but when we do that, you got to shut us down and kill the war stories. If the materials are good, let us know that. If we talked about the wrong stuff or we didn't talk about something we should have spent some time on, we would enjoy hearing that as well. Trust me, it's not like we've never been subject to criticism. Not Edmund so much, but I pass on the criticism directed to me, so he gets a vicarious enjoyment of that. But you guys are great. Look, as a veteran of the alumni of the Bar Foundation Board, I can't tell you how much the foundation appreciates what you do. None of this stuff we do gets done without you guys. Nothing. And so if we can be of a little bit of assistance to you by doing this, we want to continue to do that. And I enjoy tag teaming with my buddy Edmund here to do that. And with Renee's great support, we'll continue to do it as long as you think we're needed. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you all, and thanks for the comments. We appreciate them. I'm seeing the chat. Lots of thank yous, Skip. So grateful for that.
Yeah, very gratifying. Thank you all.